If we can come over here, I'll go through just some of how I put some of these things together. So I've laid out the colors that I'm going to use, and again, this is kind of the hard part because you have to visualize what these colors are going to mix into, not just unfired, but also once they're fired. But from experience, I have a pretty good sense of how this is going to turn out. So I lay out the colors like this, depending on how many different colors I want in the end piece. And then I start this somewhat laborious process of just mixing them all together. And it really is just kind of little mini finger wedging, depending on the amount of clay. But I never use really large amounts of clay because by the time I assemble all these different parts and pieces, I'm going to end up with quite a bit of clay, even if I start out with small amounts like this. So this is the tedious part. And the only other thing that I have to think about while I do this is the drying factor, because this clay dries quickly. It's got a lot of feldspars and flints in it. It has a tendency to dry very quickly as I mix it. So that's why I keep my water here, and I have to come back periodically and just re-wet it so I don't get the clay too dry. If it gets too dry during the mixing process, then of course when I go to laminate these all together and build my little mille fiori or narikomi piece, they won't adhere and it'll delaminate, so I've got to be careful about the consistency of the clay. As one of the confusing things with doing this process is that as you mix these colors together, even though initially there was you could see a pretty substantial difference from one end to the other, as you mix them together, because these colors aren't very intense at this point, you can see that the color variation really becomes virtually invisible. It's very hard to actually track what color is where, so that if I don't keep these in order throughout the entire process, I'm not going to end up with a smooth gradation. Again, the change, the steps from one to the other need to be very very minimal, or else you get a real kind of not a very smooth gradation. So in order to maintain that smooth gradation, I've got to have the steps be minute. And then, of course, I always run the risk of just getting things out of order. And this is a great example of it, because just looking at it visually, I can't really see the difference between one step and the next. So it's got to keep them straight at this point. Okay, all I'm going to do here is roll them flat so that I get them into a position so I can then stack them and start that layering process. And again, this is a little tricky just because I can't see, of course, the size. I've got to pretty well match up all the sizes of these little rolls, and I just do that from experience over the years, kind of getting a sense of how much pressure to apply as I do it. I wouldn't really say it's rocket science. Really, none of this is complicated. It's takes a little planning, and then after that, a lot of patience. And that is that, and then it's a simple matter of stacking them up. And they don't match perfectly as I stack them, which is fine with me. I actually oftentimes will use the edges before I'll use the the center. The center is going to be the smoothest, most perfect gradation, but it's that smoothness and perfectness that sometimes gets a little bit static for me. So the edges a lot of times will have just a slight bit of variation, and I find that a bit more appealing. So I don't struggle with that too much. And then after I do that, then I've got to actually roll it a little bit more, because if I just stacked it all up at once, it'd get real high, and then when I go to roll that out, it won't roll out evenly across the gradation. The top and the bottom will push out farther. The center will actually sink in, and so I need to flatten these out a bit, and then come back and roll them again. And now we can see if I've messed this up or not. The dark side is over here, and this is lighter over here. Now as this fires, and once we get up to about cone 9, 8 or 9, those colors are going to pop out quite a bit, and this is going to be a much more intense blue, and this will be a much more pastel, almost a lavender color over here. But all that is dependent on memory until I get it fired. Start afresh and look at this and decide what we can do with this standard gradation. And so what I'm doing here is I'm just slicing parts off. And because what I want is I want to end up with that gradation, but I want it to be triangular. If I were just to manipulate this block into a triangular shape, I'm going to alter the gradation, because I've got a lot more of this color up here than I do of this down here once it becomes a triangle. So to keep the gradation the same, I've got to slice it up, and then I end up with these left over, and I'll just reverse the direction on this. So this will end up being its own little intrigue, because now I've got on this side the gradation going from light to dark, and over here from dark to light. So it goes in reverse order. I'll just set that aside and work with this. Now, this technique is very similar. Actually, my first encounter with it was from the glass process called mille fiori. And when I was still doing glass, which I did for several years, that's where I started doing this. And when I left glass to return to ceramics, I wanted to take this technique with me, and that was when I developed this process in porcelain. One of the significant differences between doing this process in glass and doing it in clay is that in glass I can just stick a punty on either end of this and stretch it. As long as it's hot enough, I can stretch it for miles until it cools down. It'd be a challenge to stretch it for miles because it cools down pretty quickly. But the concept is there that the glass will stretch and maintain the same image within the body of this little roll. With ceramics, I can. If I go to stretch this, it's not going to. I can stretch maybe about that far, and then it's going to snap right in two, because it doesn't have the elasticity that glass does. So what I've got to do with it, see, that's where you run into that stuff, is by just trying to stretch it, it's not going to do it. This clay body, as I think I mentioned earlier, actually doesn't have much clay in it. It's only about 25% clay. The rest of it is all non-plastic feldspars and flints. So it doesn't have a lot of plasticity. I can't stretch it much. So what I have to do is just work it.